Hey everyone, how are you today? So this is going to be about Chapter 11, the family, and this is part 2 of my lecture from Monday, November 2nd. So if you are a hybrid B group, you probably want to wait till you have class on Wednesday so you can watch the first part of the lecture, take notes, because this lecture follows up. So you should be watching this lecture on Thursday, taking notes, and then completing the exit slip if you're in Group B. Group A, hopefully, if you're watching this right now, feel free to watch it here on Tuesday on election day or watch it on Wednesday. Fill out that exit slip so it's done by Thursday when you come to class. And then remember, you're completing as well, everyone, that assignment about the family. There's 20 different questions or categories. You're going to be picking 10 that interest you, basically kind of hypothesizing the answer, finding the correct answer, and then answering those 3 questions at the bottom of the second page. So what we're going to be talking about in this second part of the lecture on Chapter 11, the family, is just going to continue to discuss some of the basic components of a family and what the role of the family is, how different sociological theories view the family. So that'll go back to, the conflict, the functionalist, the symbolic interactionist view of the family. We're going to talk about some of the myths of the family, and that's what the assignment related to page 259, number 1 and 2 that you're doing. And just continue to talk about how families have changed over time. So remote learners, you can just keep on going with watching these lectures, taking notes, completing the exit slip. But if you're hybrid group A, feel free to be watching this Tuesday or Wednesday. And if you're hybrid group B, you're going to want to wait to watch this till Thursday, just because we have kind of a weird schedule this week and I'm not posting it on the normal remote day because things are just different. So here we go. We're going to pick it up with talking about lineage. And I've got some more artwork for you from little kids if you ask them to draw about a family. Those are supposed to be the windows of a house, in case you were wondering about that fantastic artwork. And we need to talk about basically, how does a family trace its ancestry? So how do they decide, when they do get married, what kind of last name are they going to have? And America is a society that historically has been patrilineal. And so ancestry is passed on and traced through the man. And so it's why traditionally in American culture, women have taken their husband's last name. Obviously in recent years, we've seen that more people are choosing to retain their maiden name before they're married, or they're choosing to hyphenate their maiden name and their new married name. Or we've even seen some people who come up with a new combination of both names, which I think is really interesting. So both of them are forced to take a new name. And people have very, mixed feelings about this, where some people feel that, it's insulting that they have to take their husband's name, or they want to retain their maiden name so people recognize them. They feel like they're losing part of their identity. That was my best friend's answer. She chose to keep her maiden name, and she felt like she was losing a part of herself if she took his name. I think she just didn't like his last name, but that's what she claimed. Other people, of course, choose to keep their maiden name because they're already established in their career, like they're a doctor, and so everybody in their profession is already, familiar with that name. Other people are very proud of taking their husband's name and feel that, it's part of the acceptance and the tradition and like officially joining the two families. So there's various ideas on that, but that's kind of been, the history, at least in the US. We see that other cultures, though, have a matrilineal concept where you're going to be tracing ancestry on the female side through the mother's last name. And that's obviously not something that's very common, in the United States, pretty much ever. We see yet again some Native American tribes have done this. When you look at cultures like Hispanic cultures and what they do in Spain and Mexico, it's pretty complicated as far as how they choose to, retain names. But that would be something more along those lines. And same thing with bilateral, the idea that you're kind of creating this ancestry that, involves both the male and female last name. And that's kind of what some couples have chosen to do, is they kind of hyphenate names or, create a new name, which is a combination of both. We're going to skip our videos for now. I'll be posting this lecture later this week in Google Classroom, so feel free to go back and watch them. But I figured for streaming purposes, I would just kind of skip those. So that was kind of just a slide that we hadn't gotten to last time. It was just some of the basic information that I had hoped that we would get through in class about, who has the power in terms of patriarchy, in terms of how do they choose their last name, how do they trace their ancestry in terms of lineage. We're going to talk a little bit more about, I really didn't talk a whole lot about locality, like where does a family choose to live? Do they choose to be patrilocal and live close to the husband's family, or do they choose to be matrilocal and choose to live near the wife's family? Or are they what we call neoloco? Do they choose neolocal, I should say? Do they choose to kind of live near neither of those groups and kind of live off on their own? That's personally what my husband and I did. We chose this neolocal, so we didn't want to be, my husband was really against moving to Chicago, where I'm from. That was just really different for him. And, I really didn't want to move to the small town where he was from. We figured, by locking into a city like that, we were going to, really have strong bonds and connections with old friends from that area or those relatives. But in a way, it would be harder to get away and see the other side of the family. And I don't know, we just thought that it would kind of favor one side of the family and cause problems. So we chose to be neolocal. So, neither of our parents live in this community. We have aunts and uncles who live in Geneseo and such, but we don't actually have any relatives who live, like our mom and dad don't live in here by any means. So moving into the next segment, I want to talk about pretty much how families have changed over time and how families have changed in response to political and economic issues and just cultural changes happening in America. So obviously, if you look at this pre-industrial revolution kind of picture, most societies, relied upon agriculture in terms of how they would make their money. And so whether we're talking about European nations or whether we're talking about people who lived in the United States, they were farm communities and people made their money through farming. So everyone kind of had an equal role and share of the workload. Everyone was essential and vital into helping make that farm successful, men and women, even though we usually saw that it was kind of patriarchal in terms of the power source, or men had the final say, but women would perhaps, kind of influence their husbands. But in general, they were a very tight-knit, close group because they were growing their own food, cooking their own food, perhaps making their own clothes, perhaps trading with other people in the community, perhaps going into town on a weekend to sell their goods, or religion early on in European countries and in American history played a vital role. So they would go into town for church on Sundays. And so, this was kind of a tight-knit little family structure. And kids were definitely expected to be obedient, to listen to their parents, to be respectful. But everybody had their real certain roles to play. And definitely, family would have impacted your personality and your sense of self-concept. Now, of course, over time, we are seeing that things are changing, because when we're looking at, these very traditional societies compared to societies that have gone through the Industrial Revolution and more modern societies, we're going to see changings coming about. And like I said, when it comes to some of these, changes, for the most part, really and truly, America is still very much so a patriarchal society where it can be traditional in its views and men sometimes are dominant. But I'd really say that since the 1960s, since the women's liberation movement, women have pushed for equality, for rights. It's changed relationship status. I'm sure that you've seen that, in your own families. And that, there's definitely kind of a power struggle going on, but things are much more equal in terms of the decision-making process, the sharing of responsibility, parenting, etc. And so those changes have happened over time. And especially whether, I said man and woman, but it could be woman and woman, it could be man and man. In terms of sharing responsibilities, household chores, parenting, making major decisions about purchases in the home, anything like that, in terms of instituting what they believe, what they value. But we've also seen shifts that, our shift in the United States has been really based upon, a shift from agriculture to industrialization, and then from industrialization into this modern world that is very digitized. There are obviously societies around the world which, are third world countries, which are very traditional, that are still agricultural based. And so they haven't changed as much, kind of on the flip side of the coin. where they might still be patriarchal and focused on patrilineal. They may perhaps live with extended families. And of course, we see other places around the globe that have arranged marriages. Women have very little rights and are controlled by their fathers and then by their husbands as they're told who to marry and who to live their lives with. So as much as we've changed, other cultures perhaps have not. I mean, I think the Amish is always an excellent segment of our society to look at when you look at that subculture and think about, as much as we perhaps have changed, they continue to practice the same values and traditions. So, of course, things changed. The first Industrial Revolution began in the mid-1700s in England and came to the United States. We really see the bigger changes come about in the mid-1800s after the Civil War, with that Second Industrial Revolution beginning in Germany, spreading throughout Europe, coming to the United States, as Americans were trying to, rebuild after the Civil War. And, they were going to be needing to produce massive amounts of supplies to kind of rebuild the South. And they realized the importance of the railroad so that they could, travel across the country and ship goods. And they were looking for new energy sources for the railroad. And so they're becoming more reliant upon oil. They're creating the light bulb, so obviously electricity will be made to power some of the new machinery. They're drilling for oil efficiently to power the new cars and planes which are being created. And so life is just changing. And as people realize it's very difficult to farm the Great Plains out west, and they find it difficult to become cattle ranchers, they choose instead by the 1900s for the most part to work in factories. And many immigrants are coming to America in hope of a better life to escape poverty at home, like the Irish potato famine or political strife. So they're coming to America to be like the great industrialists, tycoons, the robber barons of the Gilded Age, to have wealth, to realize that American dream. So many people are working in the factory as all these new inventions are being made. And of course, men, women, and even their children perhaps are working in the factory, especially if they're immigrants, because they're desperate to make ends meet. They're not getting paid very well because the factory owners, these robber barons, are focused on their own wealth. People like Cornelius Vanderbilt or John D. Rockefeller, they're just wanting to live a lavish lifestyle. And for the rest of Americans stuck living in these tenement apartments, it can definitely be a struggle. So, obviously education was not mandatory at this point, but the factory, many people say, changes the home life, because now instead of working as a tight-knit group where everybody has an important role and responsibility to produce wealth, they are going outside of their home to gain employment, to make money. And when obviously the husband is unable to make enough money, the wife perhaps has to work, and then perhaps even the children have to work. And, since school was not mandatory, it was another way for them to bring in income. It was preferable, especially in middle-class women, that women only worked till they were married. And then they would work in those pink professions. I know that sounds full of gender bias, and it is, where they would work as secretaries and teachers and nurses. And then as soon as they got married, had kids, they were supposed to stay home. But poorer families, you see more of the middle-class family there on the left, but poorer families had to, send their wives to work, their kids to work. And, we're not going to see any kind of child labor laws really put in place until the Great Depression. But this is really going to start to change things where, it really kind of perhaps separates the family apart. It gives them their own independence, perhaps their own space. And then eventually, once we put child labor laws into place and we see kids being forced to go to school, high school becoming more commonplace as we get to the 1920s and 1930s, we're going to start to see more the rise of the teenager, a period of time of adolescence. And so yet again, a further kind of separation between the moms, the dads, and really the children, and kind of, the role of the peer group and school emerging in terms of how it impacts the self. So the family will continue to be this primary group influencing you and teaching you values and norms and socializing you in society. But over time, as the parents are leaving the home for employment, kids are starting to do other things on their own and develop their own unique sense of self. And so as we get to, more of a modern industrial age, especially in the late 1800s and into the early 1900s, we're starting to see that more of the nuclear family concept is developing as people are moving away from the country and into the cities. They are living in slum apartments. They are not kind of cohabitating with any kind of extended family. We start to see that it's definitely still a patriarchy, but it may be more of a move towards or a shift towards a kind of an equal relationship. As children are going out on their own and going to work, and then later perhaps even going to school, they're developing their own sense of self. They're eventually going to, be choosing their own partners, focusing more on dating and courtship. And dating will start to evolve, especially as we get into the early 1900s. As kids are going off into school and working part-time jobs and such and getting kind of outside of the home. And so life is definitely changing. And as we look at more of the modern family, the post-industrial family, so looking at, what's really happened with families, since World War II to now, we're starting to see that obviously things are changing, where it's become, more acceptable for women to work outside the home and not just to stay home and take care of their kids, which, as I said, if you were a middle-class mother during most of the 20th century, it was really expected that you could work for an additional income, until you got married, but then you were supposed to stay home and take care of the house and then take care of the kids, and that was your life. And unless you, were desperate for money, that was pretty much the plan. It was only after, World War II, of course, and Rose of the Riveter, and women had taken over jobs, during the war, and they got used to working, that, once we get into the 1950s, many women want to continue working. They push for more rights. And as we get into the 1960s and beyond, we see the push for the women's rights movement, where we start to see, two-owner families becoming the norm, where the husband and wife works. But honestly, that's still, even though there's a push for it in the 60s and 70s, it really doesn't truly become the norm until the 80s and into the 90s. Otherwise, a lot of women still only worked part-time or sold different items like Tupperware or makeup and such. And so it's definitely kind of changed things. And then it became the norm, obviously, for kids to attend school, to have jobs outside the home, for them to date, for them to pick their partners, more of a, an equal role of husbands and wives. And then, of course, in time, as we move to the late 20th century and into the 21st century, of course, marriage has changed and the family has changed again once we've seen, the legalization of gay marriage and things like that. Now, there is some talk of, now that we are in this new technological revolution, what impact is it having to the family now as people are starting to work from home? I mean, even pre-COVID, people working from home, they were telecommuting. It's turned the home into the center of family life. How will that have a lasting impact on the relations between moms, dads, dads and dads, moms and moms, and the role of their children and kind of the impact it has on you in terms of development and your personality. And it will be really interesting to see, how COVID in the long term has impacts. Some of you said that you were eager to return to hybrid because you couldn't stand working at home and being under one roof with all these people and with your parents and trying to share the internet and not just having enough physical space to work and found that quite challenging. So it'll be curious to see, if sociologists kind of study the impact of COVID on all of us and our development in the long term. So as you're reading page 259 and doing questions 1 and 2, it talks about the myth of the traditional family, that somehow, somewhere along the way, mostly because of the media and television, people got it in their head that once upon a time, America was this amazing place. I mean, I know I definitely felt like that growing up. And that life was perfect if we went back to the 1950s. And all I had to do was watch shows like Leave It to Beaver and The Donna Reed Show and, oh gosh, I can't even think of some. Dennis the Menace. I don't know. I can't even like think at the top of my head at the moment. Oh, I Love Lucy. And they showed like these perfect little families where everything was great. I don't know. I was forced to watch a lot of them on it was Nickelodeon during the day, and then come 8 o'clock, it switched to Nick at night. And my parents loved it. We watched these old crap shows. But if you've ever seen Brady Bunch from the 70s, which was still pretty hip and modern at the time because, it was the idea of a blended family and remarriage. But there was these myths that were really perpetuated in the media that somehow people were happier once upon a time, which is completely untrue. It's just that, they might like, well, look at the divorce rate, it was lower. The divorce rate was lower if you go back in history because people were literally ostracized. Like no one would hang out with them if they were divorced. It was a no-no. And then of course, states literally had in place laws where, you could not have gay marriage in place. So that was not an option either. So people, for the most part, were miserable. They were stuck pretending to be someone they weren't, hiding who they really were, stuck in loveless marriages, perhaps with domestic violence, where they were terrified to report it to the police, afraid to get divorced because of the impact it would have on their children, because they would be from that divorced family. And so it was awful. It was anything but happier, perhaps, in some of these families. But yet again, that's just, an idealistic view of the world that got created in some TV show and that people bought into. But that's not the case at all. In reality, families have changed over time, and people, for the most part, would definitely say that they are happier making their own choices now, living their lives as they see fit. Unfortunately, yes, domestic violence still does occur because people are afraid to report it. Divorce rates have kind of ebbed and flowed, meaning at times in American history they've gone up, and at other times they've gone down. It's usually in response to crises as far as a nation and the world as a whole, meaning like they change in response to world wars, the Great Depression, 9/11. There can be events which basically impact people if they choose to stay together, or they don't have the money to physically get divorced. So there's been different issues that have impacted people over time. But definitely don't think that, families were better once upon a time or happier. That's just nonsense. So when we're thinking about what marriage looks like today, in the United States, for the most part, we practice monogamy. So it's the idea that you are going to marry one person, whoever that may be, or if you choose to cohabitate, to live with them, and a lot of people choose to cohabitate rather than to get married. And like I said, that article that I gave you for homework about the family life cycle, I had some great statistics in there, some more modern and specific information about, courtship, dating, cost of weddings, parenting styles, when it comes to divorce rates, remarriage rates, what happens to families once their kids grow up in terms of empty nesters. But for the most part in the United States, monogamy is obviously the norm. I don't know where I thought of the family assignment again out of nowhere. But there is, of course, certain cultures which do practice polygamy, which is just the general term, which means having more than one spouse. And in general, it's usually polygyny, where men have more than one wife. But it is possible that polyandry occurs, where the wife has more than one husband, but that's pretty rare. And you might have heard of before the term bigamy, where when it comes to bigamy, this is just the idea that, in a society, most societies think that polygamy is taboo, that it's wrong, that you're not allowed to do that. So if you hear someone is accused of bigamy in the United States, they are accused of being a polygamist, of having more than one spouse. But when the men have more than one wife, that's the polygyny. And when women have more than one husband, that's polyandry. And for the most part, when you hear of shows, maybe on like TLC, like Sister Wives and things like that, that would obviously be a man having more than one wife. That's polygyny. Some cultures, some religions are okay with it. We've seen it in some Muslim societies. We've seen it in some Mormon cultures. But at least in the United States, we do not recognize more than one marriage. It becomes very complicated as far as a legal aspect when it comes to, who is your actual spouse? Who inherits your property? How do you pay taxes? Are you filing jointly or separately? Like, it's just as far as legal issues, who has final rights over your health if you were, in an accident and you're in the hospital. So it becomes very complicated. And so that's part of, honestly, the reason why Americans have never supported it. But also it really just goes down to values. Even though we claim that we're a country all about separation of church and state, there is some real values that are based on religion in there. And it definitely just goes against our social norms. I think I already kind of talked about where do families live before. So I'll kind of go past this one a little bit, but I remember I was talking about how my family chose, me and my husband, when we got married, to not live like in small town Kent Point, Illinois, which is like 30 minutes from Quincy, Illinois, to live near my husband's family, or to be metro local and live in the Chicago suburbs, like Hinsdale, Oak Brook, Clarendon Hills, where I'm from. We chose to be neo-local, so we live in the Quad Cities, plus my husband got a job here, and we have aunts and uncles in the area. But, we really wanted to kind of start our own family, our own life, and then, we couldn't be accused of favoritism and such. But this is kind of especially more common in more of the industrial and the post-industrial society, when people have become less dependent on extended families. So as far as the view of the family in terms of sociologists, when it comes to functionalists, remember, some sociologists see the world as kind of the glass is half full. They focus on functionalism, how everything has a role. And they say that families are essential structure. They're definitely an essential social structure in our society because they work together early on in history as kind of one cohesive unit to make money. But they also, work as a unit, and they share resources to save money, like housing, food. And, they have some kind of system in place where some people will be the laborers, but really they take care of children and they reproduce, and they teach those children how to participate in our society and be the next generation. They may care for, elderly relatives. They provide, people with fun and entertainment and some kind of sense of self-esteem and love and support. And one of the big things is they teach kids about abstinence, that you don't reproduce until there's a time to reproduce. And so that's all part of this view of the family and the function that they serve. And of course, when it comes to the family, they teach kids about, how there are folkways and mores in our society as part of our norms, and how when it comes to some of our most important mores, they've been written down into laws, and some of them are just taboo. One of those being incest, that, it goes against any of the roles that you may hold, and that you can't participate in incest because, it would create role confusion. And if you did, you would perhaps be forced, out of your social group, out of your family. So it would definitely be a forced exogamy. Now, in terms of some of the dysfunction, or basically the problems of the modern kind of nuclear family, is that, they're more isolated than they were in the past when it was an extended family. Extended families definitely provide a group of people with more emotional support and love. And so remember, the functionalist perspective always looks at the role, the purpose of something in society and how it fits together and why it's important and valuable, but they don't ignore the problems and the dysfunction. They'd like to fix them if they could, and they do realize that there are problems, with the nuclear family and the modern family format. Now, the conflict theorists, remember, they kind of look at the problems of our society as a whole, and when it comes to the family, that is really no different, and they say that there's a huge power struggle within marriages. And so some people say, well, I'm never getting married because marriages just lead to divorce. Okay, well, even if you live with someone, it still can potentially lead to you breaking up. And if you've lived together for a long time, you're going to have to split your assets, you're going to have to split your wealth, you're going to have to split your pets, your property. It's still going to definitely be a problem. And it's not really so much, obviously, the label, which is the problem. The real problem, honestly and truly, is just lack of communication and lack of respect between the two partners, whether it's two men or two women or a man and women. But when it comes to a lot of reports, what we see happen is that, especially in this modern era, we see that both partners work, and specifically when it's the man and woman dynamic, they both work. But then when the woman comes home from work, she's still expected to take care of the family and complete the housework. And of course, that leads to resentment by her against her husband, and she gets angry about her lack of recreation, about her increased stress. Perhaps she even has to work from home for her job. And it creates a lot of anger and problems between the two of those. And that's what helps to kind of break down the dynamic and perhaps lead to divorce. Because people often get divorced because they're fighting about lack of money, lack of time, sex, And, those problems eventually kind of erupt. And then one person tends to find another person who perhaps listens to them more and tries again. One of the famous sociologists is a lady by the name of Arlie Hochschild. She specifically wrote a book called The Second Shift, where she said that this is a real problem where men and women both work. They work the same amount of hours. It's considered just as difficult. Men often still make more money than women, though, depending on the job. And then when they come home, yes, in some groups, the man and the woman do both participate in childcare and raising their children and some household duties. But in general, women are still doing more housework and taking care of the kids more. And, they're not really getting, any true support from their husband. And there might be things like the husband says, like he expresses his appreciation to his wife for being so organized that she can handle both. But that's not what she really wants. She wants someone who's going to be a partner and who's truly going to help and do the work, because otherwise it's going to cause her anxiety and stress and anger and resentment and lead to fights. And you can really see that in this table where it shows average hours per day as far as household activities. You can see that women are doing more work, women are taking care of the children or the pets more, women are going to spend more time shopping for groceries and like household supplies like toilet paper. So naturally, this is where the fighting happens. Now, symbolic interactionists, of course, are focused on that, dynamic relationship between members of the household family, and they're interested in how behavior is really influenced and, by family members, and just kind of how we define family in general, how that's changed over time. And they say that gender roles are so interesting, and the family has really kind of impacted our view of gender and our gender roles and how we pass those on to our own children and perhaps how we judge others. And so ultimately, guys, we'll be looking more at gender roles later this week, and I'll be learning a lot more about your views there, and perhaps we'll get into a journal that I was planning on doing earlier this week about how families have changed over time, and maybe some journals about gender roles. But this is what you're going to be looking at more so in your homework, is about the family life cycle and how, basically you grow up with your family of orientation. Perhaps you go through a courtship process. Perhaps you have children first, or you get married first more commonly, and you have children. And then eventually, you live this life on your own post-child rearing as an empty nester. And then, you perhaps take care of your grandchildren and stuff till the end of your life. So just to kind of wrap things up for our last slide here, when it comes to recent family trends, we see that delayed marriage is more common than ever before, so that people can go to college or begin a career, or also because being single is more acceptable. Some people choose to never get married. They don't feel like the pressure that they have to, and so they want to live their life on their own, or spend time with friends, engage in career, charity work, just spend time with their pets. We also see that delaying having children is more common than ever before, because people want to gain an education, establish a career. And so not only do people delay when they get married, but they delay having children. They may choose to be childless, to never have children because they don't want children. They want to give to charity, spend time with their pets, spend time on their interests, are afraid that they won't be good parents. So there is basically voluntary childlessness, plus some people can't have children because of infertility issues, which are often kind of, not talked about in society. We see a change that more women and men both work in the household, and that's led to shifts in terms of the power dynamic as far as, making major decisions on purchases, on money, on child care. But we also see some conflict still over if there are children in the house, doing housework, taking care of the children. We also see that one-parent families are more common than ever before because people get separated, they don't have the money to get divorced, or because they are divorced and choose not to remarry, or because their spouse obviously died, or, they basically have a child and they're not married. We know that 1/3 of the marriages that occur today, one or both the parents or partners, I should say, had been previously married. We see blended families and, step families more common than ever before. So all of these changes are definitely happening, and that's what you're going to learn more about as you do that life cycle family assignment. All right, guys, that's it for now. Complete your exit slip. Have a great day.